Hi everyone, this is R Nalule, and today we're going to continue with our webinar on energy transitions in Africa. And we're going to proceed with Ms. Noreen Kidunduhu, who's going to take us through the discussion on the barriers, the specific barriers on energy transitions in Africa. So this is a continuation of the first webinar we had, where we looked at the national initiatives to transition to a low carbon economy in Africa. And we had Dr. Mustafa to take us through the initiatives in Egypt. And we also had Ms. Tosin Timitimi, who took us through initiatives in Nigeria. And Mr. Karim Ahmed came in with the discussion from the private sector. So in this webinar, we're going to specifically look at the barriers to energy transitions in Africa. But before we start, I would like Ms. Noreen to briefly introduce herself.
Thank you, Victoria. My name is Noreen Kidunduhu. I'm a Kenya qualified lawyer and a senior associate at OK Law, which is a law firm based in Nairobi, Kenya. I am in the energy and natural resources practice.
All right, thank you very much, Noreen. So I understand your book chapter in our African energy transition book is specifically on energy transitions from an African perspective, and you bring out important and unique issues and a discussion with respect to the barriers to energy transition in Africa. So in most cases, people discuss energy transition from a global perspective, but we pay little attention to the barriers or the reasons as to why this transition is likely to take long in the African countries, and also why or how the transition is likely to affect us. So in this discussion, I would like you to briefly highlight some of the key issues you discuss in your book chapter, and also highlighting the recommendations for policymakers, governments, international organizations, and also practitioners who are interested in energy generally.
All right. Let me try and share my screen. All right, so by way of like a brief introduction or a background for those who may be watching this webinar series for the first time, what is energy transition? And despite the fact that the energy transition has and continues to be discussed widely across the globe, there isn't any generally accepted definition for it, but it is understood to mean taking up measures to reduce the energy intensity of human activities through, for example, improving energy efficiency of products and processes, and as well as reducing the carbon intensity of human activities through either deploying clean energy systems, and here clean energy is synonymous with renewables, or deploying technologies that lower carbon production, for example, carbon capture plants. Now, the energy landscape in Africa is multiplex and it's highly differentiated. For we have countries where biomass dominates their energy mix. We have oil exporting countries, and we have non-oil exporting countries that are heavily reliant on imports of petroleum products. We also have coal exporting countries like South Africa. But the common thing we see across the continent is that a majority of African countries have considerable renewable energy resources. However, these do not feature in their energy mix. And we also see that a majority of African countries have, in the last 1.5 to 2 decades, made significant oil, gas, and coal discoveries. So what then are the barriers to the energy transition in Africa? The first one is the presence of hydrocarbon reserves. The continent is heavily endowed with hydrocarbons. In fact, oil and gas companies consider Africa to be a frontier continent, owing to its huge share of unexplored reserves. Oil, gas, and coal exporting African countries rely on the rents from these resources to fund their government budgets and also to supplement government budget deficits. So the countries that have oil and gas and coal, and even the ones that have recently discovered oil, gas, and coal, are looking to capitalize these reserves and to use them to develop their countries. So it then becomes a big ask to tell African countries like these to leave their resources in the ground. The other barrier is the developmental aspirations that African countries have. At least 53 out of the 55 African countries are categorized as developing states. And almost all of them are currently pursuing efforts to develop and diversify their economies. You know, they have set out blueprints of how they're going to go about developing their economies. For example, Kenya has the Vision 2030. I think a couple of other African countries have also adopted some form of blueprint or other to develop their economies. And African populations are also continuing to grow, and the populations are also urbanizing. So this kind of development and these developmental aspirations are highly dependent on fossil fuels. We're talking about industries, we're talking about manufacturing, we're talking about transport, and various other sectors, even residential homes. This kind of developments are very fossil fuel dependent. So the transition in Africa, an energy transition in Africa, would very well mean telling, you know, African countries that they cannot take up their development aspirations because they'd have to neglect capitalizing on their fossil fuel resources. The other barrier is the cost implication of the transition. The transition calls for replacement and retirement of carbon-intensive industries and infrastructure. Workers in these industries, these are carbon-intensive industries, will be exposed to redundancies and unemployment. And so African governments are faced with, you know, this dilemma of having reduced income because they're not capitalizing their fossil fuel reserves. And then on top of that, they'll need to support carbon-intensive industries that have to be retired because of the energy transition. And then they'll also have to support, you know, the workers and all the people involved in these carbon-intensive industries who now either have to be declared redundant or unemployed. And this, of course, is a cost that will go on the balance sheet, the public balance sheet. There's in fact a study that has shown that the impact of South Africa transitioning its coal industry from its coal industry and the ripple effect that transition would have on the South African economy would cost South Africa about 120 billion US dollars. 120 billion US dollars was South Africa's 2019 budget. So you can clearly see that if today South Africa decided to transit from its coal industry, it would not be able to afford it. So we see that the cost implication of the transition is enormous. The other thing we see is, you know, the prohibitive cost of putting up clean energy systems. You know, you have the cost of research, and then you have the cost of resource mapping, where our renewable energy sources, you know, where How is our wind flow? What does our solar resource look like? You know, if you're talking about geothermal or waves and so on. So there's the cost of resource mapping. And then there's the cost of collecting all this geospatial information and the economic information of this clean energy systems. And then you have the cost of exploration, and then the cost of installing the clean energy system itself. And then the cost of constructing everything around it. You're talking about the infrastructure that goes with it. Then there's the cost of retooling the existing infrastructure to accommodate renewable energy. So there's all these costs that are involved in, you know, setting up an entire clean energy system that we do not necessarily hear people discussing when they're talking about the energy transition. In fact, there's another study that has shown that the cost of putting up a renewable energy plant corresponds to the cost of putting up a fossil fuel plant, plus all the fuel it will consume over its lifetime. So even in terms of economics, a clean energy system is even more costly than a fossil fuel energy system. So when African governments look at this kind of, you know, statistics and facts, they are faced with a clear choice between having a very expensive clean energy system, new clean energy system, or just relying on the fossil fuel system that they already have in place. And then other barriers that we see is the lack of the technological know-how. A lot of these new clean energy, or rather clean energy systems, are new inventions and new sort of machines. And the overall level of infiltration of this technology in Africa is low. And then research and development around this infrastructure and systems is also minimal in African countries. And a lot of African countries have not prioritized research and development in this particular area. So there's that lack of technological know-how. And then we also see policy related challenges. Most African countries have policies and legal frameworks in place for developing their fossil fuel resources. And at the same time, they also have, you know, climate change mitigation laws and, you know, plans. But there's no framework that marries the two. You don't see strategies for how they can capitalize their reserves, but also simultaneously keep their carbon emissions at a minimum. So we have these conflicting policies within most African countries. You know, Kenya is a good example. We have a very robust Petroleum Act, and then we also have a very robust Climate Change Act. And it's not very clear how the two marry each other. And so what are some suggestions, you know, countermeasures for African governments and African policymakers to start thinking through, because the energy transition is mainly because countries need to restrain their carbon emissions. So, you know, African countries and policymakers need to think of strategies of restraining their carbon emissions, but also that strategies that would allow them at the same time to capitalize their fossil fuel reserves. And my thoughts are this: first, African countries need to look at strategies to reduce the energy intensity of their developmental aspirations. And, you know, ideas for this is having a robust energy efficiency policy, energy conservation measures, so that even as we are developing and trying to get to a developed country status, we are reducing the energy intensity of our development. The other thing that African countries and policymakers need to look at is to reduce the carbon intensity of this same development. And some ideas for doing this is investing in clean fossil fuel technology. Right now, we have clean coal technology, which basically alters the characteristics of coal so that as you fire the coal, it doesn't emit as much carbon dioxide as it would in its natural state. We also have carbon capture and storage technology that is still being advanced, and we still need to do a lot of research and development. Of course, there's arguments that CCS is extremely expensive and it's not scalable, but we need to now start doing research and trying to look for ways to come up with CCS technology. And then we can also have co-firing systems, so that if you're going to still have a coal-fired plant, you co-fire the coal with something else, probably a biofuel, so that you reduce the amount of carbon dioxide that is being released into the atmosphere. Another way is to utilize fossil fuels as building blocks for petrochemicals, so that the use of fossil fuels is just not limited to transport and in residential homes for power generation and so on, that it becomes more of a building block for petrochemicals. But this, of course, has to go hand in hand with waste management. We have, of course, seen the discussions around plastics and the degradation of the environment. The other thing that African countries need to look at is the use of biofuels in the transport sector. What we see is that most African countries, even the ones that have been able to completely rely on renewable energy for their power generation, they'll still need fossil fuels for transport. So it may be important for African countries to begin to invest and think of using biofuels for transport. The other thing that African countries need to do is mitigate transition costs. And we're talking about the cost of moving the entire economy from a fossil fuel centered system to a clean energy system. And one way I think African countries can do this is to accelerate exploitation of their fossil fuel reserves during this time, so that they can use the funds that they generate from that sort of exploitation to be able to later meet the transition risk that lies ahead, because the transition is inevitable. The other thing African countries need to also do to mitigate the transition risk is to encourage economic diversification, especially the oil exporting countries. They need to begin to think of diversifying the economy away from just oil in anticipation of the transition. With regard to mitigating the cost of clean energy, one way is to give incentives for the uptake of renewable energy. We're talking about subsidies for renewable energy. African countries can also collaborate with international financial institutions to develop the capacity of their local banks to give funding, assess and fund renewable energy projects, so that more investors and even the private sector is incentivized to invest in renewable energy. And then, African countries also need to align their energy policies so that to their climate change mitigation plans, so that, the conflict as regards having two separate systems and policies in place is dealt with. And yeah, those generally are my thoughts with regard to the barriers to the energy transition and solutions that African governments can take up.
All right. Thank you very much, Noreen. That was a very excellent presentation. I don't even know the question to ask you, because you seem to have addressed most of the questions. But following long discussions we've been having on the issue of energy transitions, there have been fears that even if African countries were willing to transition at our own rates, we're seeing a decline in investments, especially from international organizations. And also a lot of pressure from the international organizations because in the last debate we had some of the policymakers express concerns whereby before they even submit a project to be funded, they have to show like some kind of master plan on how they're willing to transition to a low carbon economy. So what would you say be, how can African countries be able to utilize the fossil fuels and also work together with the international community, but not at the detriment of their own economic development? Because we notice energy projects are very capital intensive. So at the end of the day, we do need the investors, we do need the international monetary organizations or institutions, but how do we proceed? How do we balance all this?
Yeah. And my thoughts on that are simply this. The reason why we are transitioning to clean energy is simply because of, carbon emissions. And I think what African countries and even investors who are still looking to capitalize fossil fuel reserves in the continent need to do is have a master plan that shows how you're going to capitalize the fossil fuel reserves, but you're also going to limit the CO2, that is the carbon dioxide that is released upon capitalizing those fossil fuel reserves. So there has to be a master plan. I'm saying, for example, like in South Africa, if they're having investors coming in to capitalize or explore and produce coal, those investors and even the African governments need to have a master plan of saying, okay, so we're going to be exploring coal, but we're also going to have CCS or CCT, some form of technology to ensure that even as the coal is being used wherever it's being used, the emissions are limited. So there'll have to be, as investors are giving out their submissions and their project proposals, there has to be within the proposal what their plan is to ensure that the carbon that is emitted from whatever project they have is going to be limited in a sense. Yeah.
All right, thank you for that. And then the other question I would like to ask that has really popped up with our discussions on energy transitions is the issue of political will. Because yes, we know we are faced by climate change challenges, but then at the same time, we're not seeing a lot of commitment from African governments to really transition. And this is in most cases attributed to the fact that with fossil fuels, there is political will because of the sovereignty of the state over fossil fuels. But then with renewables, they're more of private projects. So what would your comments be with respect to political will? How can we really get the policymakers to be committed to transition to a low carbon economy?
Yeah. Actually, I think most African countries have signed the Paris Agreement, but other than signing, they haven't put in place frameworks within their countries to show, exact targets and how they're working towards limiting or mitigating, climate change impact. And I think it's for African governments to realize that the cost of staying with the fossil fuel systems and, carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is more detrimental in the future for our entire future than ignoring the entire situation altogether. And I think clean energy systems can be profitable. An entire clean energy system, when I was listing some of the costs and what is required for a clean energy system, if you look at everything that needs to be done, the exploration, the installation, there's construction, that is employment opportunities, that is investment opportunities. So we shouldn't look at it like renewable energy systems are not beneficial in terms of bringing in money to governments the same way fossil fuels are. They are productive. There's a lot of profit that can be gained from it. So it's a mental shift from thinking that this is the only way we can do things. The transition is inevitable. So we better start planning now than to wait 10 years, 20 years down the line to start putting up systems in place.
All right. And then my last question is, yes, the transition is inevitable, but also, like you mentioned in your presentation, for African countries, we're really concerned with our economic development. And also I note that by 2040, the number of people who will be having no access to modern energy will escalate, and not to mention the anticipated urbanization and industrialization. For all this to happen, we'll need fossil fuels. So as much as African countries trying to put in effort to transition, but we're also faced with these developmental needs and also social needs, because you can't explain to someone maybe in Uganda or in Kenya, someone in a rural area who is using charcoal every day, that, you know what, in 10 years to come, you have to use renewable energy, which is maybe expensive. And in 10 years to come, I know your community is not yet developed, and we know you need the oil and gas for you to be developed, but you have to transition. So how do we balance those things with respect to social needs, economic development, and also industrialization? Because unlike developed countries, which have utilized fossil fuels for centuries and centuries, for developing countries were just trying to find a balance, trying to reach that level. So most policymakers are really concerned of what practical measures can be taken to see that we transition, but at a pace where we'll still utilize our fossil fuels for economic development.
And yeah, my answer is still the same: reducing the carbon intensity of your developmental plans, and the energy intensity of your development plans as well. So we're talking about energy efficiency measures, energy conservation measures, so that even if we're using fossil fuels, instead of using so much, we use less, and then we also reduce the carbon that we are emitting. Because yes, like we said, we can't tell African countries, leave your oil, gas, and coal in the ground, and yet they need the resources that they would get from capitalizing these reserves to develop their economies. So it's for African countries, like I said, to find strategies. In fact, that is what that's what policymakers should be focusing on right now, finding strategies that will allow them to capitalize these reserves at the same time constrain their carbon emissions. And my paper has a lot more. This was just touching on the top. I've talked about emission trading. African countries may think about accepting binding commitments with regard to their emissions, and then being able to emissions trade like everyone else is doing across the world, in Europe and everywhere else. So there's so many strategies that we can think of. We just need to now have those strategies put down in policies, so that the continent is not left behind, but is also not shortchanged with the entire transition.
All right, so that marks the end of our webinar. Thank you very much, Noreen.
Thank you as well for having me.
I see some attendees. I didn't know we had some attendees. Unless you have some concluding remarks, this marks the end of our webinar. And for the participants, anyone who has a question, you can address it to Ms. Noreen. But besides that, I think we shall be ending our webinar. Could you please give the concluding remarks?
All right. Thank you. Thank you for having me. I think this kind of discussions are the kind of discussions we need to have, especially as young people, because 20, 30 years from now, we are the ones who are going to suffer the effects of not transiting in time or ignoring the transition. So we should keep having these discussions, keep pulling in policymakers and giving out what our ideas are, so that we are best able to develop our continent the best way we know how, and enjoy our resources, but also limit the effect it has on the environment.
All right, thank you very much, Noreen. It was lovely having you. And our viewers, do not forget to subscribe to my YouTube channel. And Noreen has 2 videos already there on Somalia v Kenya, and also another video on the electricity sector of Kenya. So this marks the end of our video and webinar. Stay tuned. Don't forget about tomorrow, we're having another webinar on international arbitration in the African energy sector. Stay tuned and bye-bye.